Number 278 will be the invitation song this evening after our study. 278. So if you're using your songbook, you can go ahead and turn there, and we'll be singing that song here shortly. Turn your Bibles with me once again back to the book of Ecclesiastes, and tonight we're going to be in the 8th chapter. Ecclesiastes chapter 8. I've entitled the lesson tonight, The Wisdom of a Submissive Heart. And I think that we'll all see why that is as we get into this chapter and see the things that Solomon presents to us as the way to live before God. Herb tonight, they need to replace that bunny on the Energizer commercial with Herb. It needs to be the Energizer Herb. He preached this morning in Griffith Springs. He preached again in Redfield this afternoon, and now he's leading singing tonight. Oh, you said singing at Redfield too, see? So Herb's had a busy day. So like I said, Energizer Herb. There's you some encouragement for this evening. See, if Herb can do it, you can too. So tonight, the wisdom of a submissive heart. Life does present a lot of challenges. We just got through singing about the providence of God and how he's here and there and he's everywhere. I mean, we need to realize that nothing happens outside of his purview. Nothing takes place that is outside or contrary to that which he will permit or allow. God does give man free will. And in providing man free will, that leaves room for a lot of bad things to happen. And even in the midst of bad times, we need to learn how to be humble and submissive before our God. You know, we live in a culture also where I think our greatest problem over the last few years of my life anyway, as I've seen things progress, or maybe I should say digress, the lack of respect for authority has gotten worse and worse. Our school teachers can probably vouch for that. It wasn't that way so much when I was in school. There were people who did not respect authority. But I remember one time I got a paddling by Coach Reed. I was in the 6th grade, I believe, and I hit a boy. He called my mama a dirty name, and I hit him. So I got sent to the principal's office, and he lit me up with a paddle. It's about that long, had 3 1.25 inch holes in it with a handle on it. And when he swung it, okay, you're leaning over his desk, and when he swung it, your feet come off the floor. And, you learned quickly how to respect authority because of those kinds of things back then. That's not permitted anymore. We need to learn respect for authority. There's a story about an umpire actually presented this story, and a real life story of his. There was a basketball game, a girls' basketball game, and they were about to start. And he went over to one of the girls. She had some tape on her ear, and he asked her if she had earrings in her ear. And she said, yes. And he said, well, I can't make you take the earrings out, but I can keep you from playing in the game with those earrings in. You can either tape them out and play, or you won't play. Well, here comes the coach. He's really mad. He's upset. And he lights into that referee. And the referee says, well, that's the rule. You cannot wear earrings during the game. You either take them out or you don't play. The guy said, well, the referee last night didn't say anything about it. He said, well, I can't answer for that. I can't do anything about that. But, here it is. This is the rule. So he really does. The coach just lays into him. And the coach calls the tee. The game hadn't even started yet. He's teed up. The other team gets to start with some free throws and the ball. That just makes the coach madder. So he lights into the referee even more. And the referee says, one more word and you're out. Well, guess what came next? One more word. He's out. Okay. we can make things much worse uh, when it comes to dealing with people in authority over us and dealing with our circumstances in life. We can make a a bad situation or maybe an unfavorable situation to us, we can make that a whole lot worse by our reaction to that authority. I don't know how many of you watch some of these cop shows on TV. Me and my wife, we watch uh, OP Live, and that's something we've actually done for years. I don't know. It's just something we enjoy sitting there watching and seeing what's going on in the world, because that's kind of our window into the world. We don't really have that window otherwise, and we kind of see things that are going on. And just last night, there was this guy walking down the middle of the street, and the police officer tells him to get off the road and pulls over and asks him, what's going on, and asks for his ID. The guy says, I don't have to give you my ID. And the police officer says, yes, sir, you have to identify yourself. That's the law. The guy said no. Well, things went on for a while. The police officer was very, very, very patient with this guy. But he wound up, I can't remember what actually happened to him, but he just made things worse and worse and worse. We see that a lot on that TV show. We can make things much worse for ourselves. Listen to what Solomon says. Let's read through this entire text. It says, who is like a wise man and who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the sternness of his face is changed. I say, keep the king's commandment for the sake of your oath to God. Do not be hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand for an evil thing, for he does whatever he pleases him. Where the word of a king is there is power. And who may say to him, what are you doing? He who keeps his command will experience nothing harmful. And a wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment, because for every matter there is a time and judgment, though the misery of man increases greatly. For he does not know what will happen, so who can tell him when it will occur? No one has power of the Spirit to retain the Spirit, and no one has power in the day of death. There is no release from that war, and wickedness will not deliver those who are given to it. All this I've seen and applied to my heart to every work that is done under the sun. There is a time in which one man rules over another to his own hurt. Then I saw the wicked buried, who had come and gone from the place of holiness, and they were forgotten in the city where they had so done. This also is vanity. Because the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and his days are prolonged, yet I surely know that it will be well with those who fear God, who fear him, who fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, nor will he prolong his days, which are as a shadow, because he does not fear before God. There is a vanity which occurs on the earth, that there are just men to whom it happens according to the work of the wicked. Again, there are wicked men to whom it happens according to the work of the righteous. I say that this also is vanity. So I commended enjoyment, because a man has nothing better under the sun than to eat, drink, and be merry. For this will remain with him in his labor all the days of his life, which God gives him under the sun. When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, even though one sees no sleep day or night, then I saw all the work of God, that a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. For though a man labors to discover it, yet he will not find it. Moreover, though a wise man attempts to know it, he will not be able to find it. There's something in this text that is rather humbling, from beginning all the way to the end. And this is a continual thought that Solomon is presenting to us as he's considering the enigmas of life. And he begins by pointing out that, who is a wise man and who knows the interpretation of a thing? Who knows all and has all the answers? However, even in the midst of the problems and difficulties of life, a wise man is still confident. A wise man still expresses through his persona his confidence in God, and he's going to present himself as a blessed person. Um, Only a wise man can size up these circumstances and situations and properly act. But even then, we don't always, wisdom can't, again, find all the answers to all of our problems. Even wise men make mistakes. And so a wise person may know how to act graciously, and he may avoid how to he may avoid getting himself into worse trouble, but he still lacks all of the answers. But nevertheless, wisdom is necessary and extremely important when it comes to dealing with life's enigmas. There is confidence in the wise man regardless of his circumstances. Why? Because he trusts God. He fears God. And that is his foundation, the root of his calmness and his peace of mind, even in the midst of hardship. Solomon says, I say, keep the king's commandment for the sake of your oath to God. Colossians 3 was read earlier. And I think that text, it talks about submission, the submission of wives to their husbands, and submission to those who are over you in any realm. Okay, children, obey your parents in the Lord. All of these examples of people with authority over others, those who are in positions of being under authority need to know how to respond to that authority. Keep the king's command. These principles, again, apply to all of our relationships. And by the way, the Apostle Paul also says that we are to submit to one another as children of God. We ought to always think about how our actions, how our words are affecting others, and what the will and the desires of other people are in all of our relationships. So here specifically in regard to the civil government, submit. And Paul deals with this in Romans 13. We've talked about that. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 17 also deals with this very same issue. The government is God's agent to punish the wicked and to reward and support the faithful, the godly. It doesn't always work that way. Sometimes there are wicked kings. There are wicked governments. However, all government is from God. Regardless of the worth of the one who is over us, regardless of his own standing with God, regardless of that, I am to recognize his authority and submit to that authority. My submission has absolutely nothing to do with him personally. It has to do with my oath to God and my submission to God, and recognizing the authorities that God has placed in this world. Wives, obey or submit to your husbands. Children, obey your parents. Servants, obey your masters. Even the masters have to give an account to God. So we need to realize and think about all of those situations. So be submissive. And in verse 3, do not be hasty to go from his presence. It has a sense of quitting one's service or one's duty before the king. That's kind of dumb. Of course, we live in a democracy. And maybe we're really unfamiliar with this concept of people standing before the king. Esther, she was afraid to go in before the king uninvited because he could have her killed. That's the circumstance. Okay, so you're invited before. How dare you walk out on the king? How dare you, treat him as though he is less than the one who has all authority over you. You simply do not do that. And do not take a stand for an evil thing. Don't join with the rebels. Don't fight against the king. because the king does whatever he pleases. And of course, the main reason, again, you have made an oath to God. You are God's uh, servant, and therefore you serve those who God has placed over you. But the reality is, kings have authority, and they need to be respected. That applies again to any person in positions of authority. Where the word of the king is, there is power, and who may say to him, "What are you doing?" Um, you want to argue with the king? That doesn't go well. Um, of course, here's one thing though. When you think about what Solomon is saying here, he's using the temporal, the earthly example of the king and the civil government. But we must remember that God is sovereign, and He is what He says goes. Look, the kingdom of Christ is not a democracy. Jesus is king, and He must be reverenced as King and Lord. And so, not only in the temporal world and in Solomon's world, but also even in the spiritual world, to rebel against our King, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, it's a matter of self-preservation. I rebel, I die, because I separate myself from the one who gives life and who has the words of life. And yes, that in the earthly realm, there are exceptions. I mean, when a king commands us to do that which is wrong, we ought to obey God rather than men. Peter and John made that perfectly clear in Acts 4. We need to understand that. Again, that relates to all of our relationships and the authorities under which we are. But if someone commands us to do that which God forbids, then we're not to do it. If someone forbids us to do that which God commands, we are to do what God commands and not obey the one in authority over us. We obey God, not man. However, in any other circumstance, we are to obey those who are over us. A wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment. Because for every matter there is a time and judgment, though the misery of man increases greatly, for he does not know what will happen, so who can tell him when it will occur? A wise man understands, look, you know what, everything works out the way it should. I mean, if this guy, if the one that's over me is a tyrant, one of these days he's going to get what's coming to him. That's not my job. But what's going to happen to him? One day he's going to have to stand before God himself. And when we're not being treated well, or the way that we think we ought to be treated, the tendency is to rebel against that authority. That doesn't make for a good situation. This is just practical stuff here in life, okay? You rebel against the authority, you get pulled over by a police officer, and he walks up to the window and he asks you for your license and registration, please, and you say, I don't have to give it to you. All right. Hair starts going up on the back of his neck. He knows something's wrong. And now you set yourself up for more trouble. Be careful. Also, the providence of God comes into play. There are things that we need to understand, brethren, that we don't have control over a lot of stuff in this world. Often we don't have control over who is over us. We don't have control over who's in that police car. We don't have control over who the governor is. We get to vote, but we're not the only ones voting, are we? We don't always have control over those things. Well, we don't have control over those things. I'll tell you something we definitely don't have control over. We don't have control over the wind. We have absolutely no control. And this is one of these passages, and there are a couple here in this context, where the meaning of it is not just real clear. Literally, this text says, no one has power over the wind, with the wind. And certainly that's true. Now, Jesus did. When Jesus said, "Peace be still," what happened? The wind stopped. But which one of the apostles could do that? What other man can do that? Can't do that. But more than likely, this has to do with, and in the context, I think this makes more sense, although not all the scholars agree with my assessment on this. But it just seems like he's talking about, and I think the New King James translation does get it right, who has power over the spirit to retain the spirit, and no one has power in the day of death. Okay? Can you prevent your death in the day of death? Who has control over or power over the spirit? I will tell you, Jesus did. Jesus said, "Father, I commit my spirit into your hands." He gave up the ghost. We don't have that power. Death is an unavoidable part of life. Can't be escaped. We'll see that more in chapter 9. And also, of course, he makes the point there is no release from that war. Now, the war, okay, between life and death. And he presents it in a case like, okay, when it comes to a battle, I mean, you've been employed by the king to go into battle. You can't just decide, I don't want to go. I don't want to do this. I quit. We know what that's called. And what happens to people who do that? If they're caught, they're put to death. You know, they're treasonous. So you have the consequences of that. However, he says the wickedness will not deliver those who are given to it. Wickedness is not going to. Here's the point: we reap what we sow, and that's just a law that God has unchangeably placed into this world. We will reap what we sow. You sow to the spirit of the spirit, you'll reap life everlasting. But what if you sow to the flesh? You will of the flesh reap corruption. But that's your choice. You will reap what you sow. Wickedness, if you choose the path of wickedness, it doesn't matter how much money that you have. It doesn't matter how much power that you have. You're not going to escape that rule, that principle. Wickedness isn't going to help you. In verse 9, and all this I have seen and applied my heart to every work that is done under the sun. There is a time in which one man rules over another to his own hurt. We need to anticipate that things are not going to go like we want them to go. We need to anticipate that there are people who are cruel to us. They won't treat us fairly. And rulers can reign over others to their own hurt. And the New King James translates it that way. Literally, the NASB says over another to his hurt. And some commentators, they argue that this is, there's a time in which one man rules over another to that person that he's ruling over's hurt and his pain. In other words, the one in authority has the power in him, in his authority, to cause pain to those under him. Now, we know that's true. But I will say there's something to be said for the idea that the New King James puts out here, that a man rules over another to his own. Now, listen, if you mistreat those who are under you, what's eventually going to happen to you? It will come back to you. You will reap what you sow. So either way, oppressive rulers cause misery to others, and that's what the proverb writer also states, while simultaneously they bring harm upon themselves. Be wise. If you are in a position of authority, treat others with kindness and concern and fairness. If you are under the control of others, be wise. Be submissive. Don't bring upon yourself undue pain. But in verse 10, then I saw the wicked buried, who had come and gone from the place of holiness, and they were forgotten in the city where they had so done. This also is vanity. The wicked will soon be forgotten, even though they are attenders at the local synagogue. Doesn't matter if they're wicked, they will be forgotten. Why do some folks persist in their evil? Well, because the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily. Okay, we see that in our justice system today. We see someone who is convicted of murder by a jury of his peers. Um, and it may be 20, 30 years, and they're still sitting on death row. They've been there all this time, eating 3 meals a day and watching TV. That's not fair either, is it? And so there's no consequence for wickedness. So what's going to deter them from other people from being wicked? There is no deterrent. So, okay, this explains why wickedness expands, wickedness continues on. What if God destroyed every person the moment they sinned? None of us would be here. That's what would happen. We would not be here. So God allows things to go on. He's long suffering, right? That's Romans chapter 2. And we can easily misinterpret God's patience and God's long suffering. And we think that he's just overlooking sin. And so we are, in our own stupidity, we continue in that sin thinking that we're getting away with it. But what's eventually going to happen? We're going to stand in judgment before God. And we will be judged according to our works. And there is no partiality with God. Romans 2 and verse 11. So, even so, here's the point. Fear God. Regardless of your circumstances in life, regardless of those who may be over you in this temporal world, fear God. Obey him. Serve him. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and his days are prolonged, yet I surely know that it will be well with those who fear God, who fear before him. That's what the wise man knows. You know what? I know that too. I know that those who fear God, regardless of this world's circumstances, it can be falling down all around us. But if we fear God, all things will work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. Romans 8 and verse 28. We know that. That's confidence. And our face can shine in that regard. That's a Jewish idiom for the expression of blessing. So I know that to fear God, that will bring blessing. Now, what's going to happen to the wicked? They're going to get what's coming to them. Although under the sun, what appears to us to happen? Well, we see a just man, a godly man, a righteous man, and he's suffering like we would think a wicked man ought to suffer. And then we see the wicked, and boy, they just got money coming in. They got all the nice stuff to play with in their lives. They've got everything that you could want. Everything's going so good for them. And that just doesn't seem fair. So as Denise says, a fair is a place you go to ride rides. It's not the world that we live in. It's not fair. The righteous do suffer. Why? Because there are wicked people in the world. There's sin in the world. And though we may perceive that, people who are wicked, well, they tend to live just as happy or happier than we do. We're the ones that's living from paycheck to paycheck. We're the ones that's struggling. We're the ones that are made fun of and ridiculed. And, these wicked people, they cheat, they steal, they lie. Think of all those politicians up there in Washington, D.C. All those corrupt, crooked politicians, and they're just padding their pockets with our money, and they have all the stuff that they want in life. We could become envious of that. Not going to help us any to do that. But I will tell you something. One day they're going to have to stand before God, and they're going to have to give an account for what they've done. And I would not want to be in their shoes on that day. So we may see things as being unfair in this life, and they are. But one day all the wrongs are going to be made right. God is going to judge, and God is going to punish the wicked, and he's going to reward the righteous. Much like that rich man and Lazarus. The rich man fared sumptuously every day. He had it good, but he died. Lazarus didn't have it so good in life, and he died. Which one would you rather be? Huh. So, in all of this, what we need is meekness, patience, humility. Meekness and patience comes from humility and trust and faith. Okay? So we trust God. We submit to God. We're humble before him. That brings about a blessing in life. And so, even though we see things unfair and all the bad things happening around us, we all still are blessed, probably beyond what we sometimes realize. You know, if we were just stopped, and we sing the song sometimes, Count Your Many Blessings, we think things are really going hard or going rough and tough, bad, and we start to get down on ourselves. We start to get down on life. What if we just stopped and counted our blessings? Think about all the things that God has blessed us with. And so in verse 15, so I commend enjoyment, because a man has nothing better under the sun than to eat, drink, and to be merry. Enjoy what you have. Enjoy it where you are. Learn to trust God and know that all things do indeed work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. Take what God gives you in this life that is good. Enjoy it. I have known some people that in their last days of life, one lady in particular, she lived to be 101 years old in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. And in fact, I have one of her paintings hanging up at my house. She painted it when she was 99 years old. But I went to visit her one day in the hospital, and she was just a few days from dying. But one of the nurses stopped me in the hall, and she says, I've never met anyone like this lady. She says, all she talks about is God and the Bible. All she talks about is heaven. And she always talks about it with a big smile on her face, knowing she's about to die. That has an impact on people. So regardless of our circumstances, if we were to count our blessings, okay, so I don't have money. Okay, I don't have a nice house. I don't have nice cars. I don't have all this stuff. I got Jesus. I've got all the spiritual blessings in Christ. I may not have a thing materially. I may not have a penny to my name, but I have Jesus. What else do I need? Can I be happy in that? Can I be blessed in that? Ecclesiastes 8 and verse 16, when I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, even though one sees no sleep day or night, okay, so he's trying to figure out all the problems that he sees in life. You know what? Our minds can't solve all the problems. So what do we have to do? We have to resign ourselves over to God. And we have to recognize that God is the one who has all. I don't. God has all the answers. So place my trust in God. That's going to give me that confidence. That's going to give me that peace of mind. That's going to give me even joy, even in the midst of my trials. As James says in James 1 and verse 2, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. We can't know everything. We can't understand everything. I believe, by the way, that's the Apostle Paul's point in Romans chapter 8, as he begins there in verse 17, and he talks about the suffering that we experience and how we need to, count it all joy and point to and look at the future and eternity and just compare the suffering of this present time. If we just stopped and done that, compare the suffering of this present time with the glory that shall be revealed in us. As bad as it may feel right now, in eternity, it'll be nothing. So we resign ourselves to our trust in God. We see all the work of God. We can't find out the answers. We don't know everything there is to know or why things are the way they are fully. Even though we may labor and try and lose all the sleep, trying to figure it out, doesn't matter. God has the answers. And so that's why James says in James 4:7, therefore submit to God. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. Draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Lament, mourn, and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Well, that's talking about, instead of living it up and enjoying the material things in life to the point of extreme. Sorrow over sin. Get your heart right with God. Humble yourselves in the sight of God, the Lord. And what will he do? He'll lift you up. And as Peter says in 1 Peter 2 and verse 13, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. Okay. And that's what we've been seeing here in Ecclesiastes. Be humble, be submissive. Verse 15, for this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorant of foolish men. As free, not using liberty as a cloak or vice, but as bondservants of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. For this is commendable if because of conscience toward God one endures grief, suffering wrongfully. Okay? That's what we've seen here in Ecclesiastes. That's what Solomon is advising us. Peter did the same thing. For what credit is it if when you are beaten for your faults, you take it patiently, but when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. For to this you are called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps. Jesus suffered for us. Life does present all kinds of problems and apparent contradictions. Life's not easy, it's not fair. And we can, by our actions, make life a lot more difficult. But be submissive. Submit to God. What we really need to do is recognize the necessity of being humble before God, submitting to God. That's the beginning of God being able to work with us. That's the Beatitudes in Matthew 5, beginning in verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall see the kingdom of God. That's the person that is blessed by God. Even though we may be surrounded by wickedness, fearing God is the only, and trusting God is the only reasonable response that will help us in life. In Hebrews 5 in verses 5 through 9, the text says, so also Christ did not glorify himself to become high priest, but it was he who said to him, you are my son, today I've begotten you. As he also says in another place, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek, who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and was heard because of his godly fear, yet he was a son, yet he learned though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered, and having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all them that obey him. Have you obeyed Jesus Christ and submitted him? When Jesus was on the earth, how did he live? Did he submit himself to the governing authorities? Did he submit himself to those who were over him in this world? Yes. And he lived wisely. But you know what? Even living wisely, Jesus was crucified. Even though you may do everything right, wicked people are still wicked people. But here's the example. And he became the author of eternal salvation unto all them that obey him. Have you obeyed the Lord? God is calling you, and will you accept his call? Maybe you're here tonight, you never rendered obedience to the gospel of Jesus Christ. You can obey him, be baptized into Christ, and you can be raised to walk in newness of life tonight. Trust the Lord, regardless of your circumstances. Maybe there's difficulties in your life that you need prayers, you need encouragement. We'd be glad to do that. If there's something amiss in your life, some sin that you've committed, that you need the forgiveness of a brethren here, you need to confess that sin before them. Any way that we can help you, won't you come while we stand and while we sing? God is calling.